so that the Port Monroe Authority wouldn't need to incur an expense. But this is really a Port Monroe Authority plan, not a City of Hampton plan. We were just being a good partner in providing facilitation services. Now that strategic action plan that Glenn asked that we help form through facilitation is a way to prioritize the goals and objectives of the FMA for the next 5 years. Since our last meeting, that community development team has worked with FMA staff, partners, stakeholder groups to ensure that public engagement directed the process. Unfortunately, many of those group meetings were able to happen just before the pandemic hit, so we did get to have those stakeholder meetings. The plan also had intended to include an online opportunity, but that did not happen. So I just want to acknowledge that we had not gotten to do that for a variety of reasons. What we're going to do today, John McBride, who led that community development team, is going to present a summary of the results of those meetings, discuss the next steps for engaging with the FMA and National Park Service staff, provide feedback online, receive feedback online from key stakeholders and focus group members who could not attend those meetings that were held prior to COVID-19's shutdowns, report back to the community, and then how we would proceed engaging with the board in September to complete the work of prioritization. So with that as a brief introduction, I'll turn it over to Jonathan McBride, who has been leading the facilitation team.
Thank you, Ms. Bunting. Good morning, board. It's good to be with you. I was hoping to actually do this introduction back in April at your retreat, so we get to know you a little better as we go through the process, but as you know, here we are in June. So I'm glad to be here. Just a little background. I've been with the city now for 15 years working with housing and neighborhood services. So I've got a background in working with neighborhood organizations, but as I mentioned to the directors, we met with them back at the beginning of the year. This is home. Hampton has been my home. I've grown up in the fields of Fort Monroe in the summers and at the beaches. So the success of what you do when we go through this process isn't just my own professional success for neighborhoods, it's personal. I want to see Fort Monroe succeed through this process. And so how we got involved is actually I got a chance to work with Mr. Oder through our 2019 commission, our local Hampton commission. We were asked, me and another coworker were asked to come in and help facilitate the planning process, strategic planning process for that committee to get a plan together for the events that happened for the 2019 commemoration last year. And so that was the first piece, and then that followed on. Last year we worked with the Phoebus Partnership to do a strategic planning process similar to what we're undertaking now. And that has now come to a completion with them, and they've adopted that plan and are moving forward with some implementation pieces. So this really is a board and organizational plan. This isn't a land use plan in any way, as we've mentioned before. This is about how do you form and structure your work so that you can be successful in the future. And so as the manager mentioned, and if you want to go on to the next, I'll just kind of run down the quick process that we've broken down. It's kind of, there's a first phase and a second phase, and so we had almost completed the first phase in March with the focus groups. I think our last focus group was on the Thursday before the work at home order came, and so that created, we had some opportunities to complete those focus groups, which I'll talk about in a minute. That did leave us with some lack of opportunities to connect and follow up with some groups that weren't able to participate. So we hope to complete some of that. We're going to bring to you those priorities in April so that you all can make some decisions. We've now pushed that back to September so that you all can help make some decisions on how we move forward so that we can clean up the engagement piece here before that September meeting. And then we'll be doing strategic outcomes and this process that we look at really is an asset-based approach. So we look at the strengths of what you have as a site, as an organization, as a community, and then look at what are the things that you're trying to hope to achieve. So it focuses on the positive and then goes and looks at what's missing that's keeping you from getting there, and then sets the actions in place. So that's the process in a whole. If you go to the next slide. So we had a series of focus groups. We started with the directors and staff. We had some partner agencies at the table, community representatives, and authority stakeholders. We were able to go through that process of them identifying assets to the site. They identified values that they feel are important for our success. So as a community, as an organization, what are the values that need to be in place to be successful? And then ultimately what we wanted to get to at that conversation, these are about 2-hour conversations each, was to some outcome statements. What are the outcomes that they hope to see? If we're successful in everything that we're doing here, what's it look like? What does that, where are we going? And so those outcome statements, if we go into the next slide, were broken down into 8 themes, and these are the top themes I'll share with you first. And what you see in bold are the outcome statements that were in the top 5 of each of those focus groups. And then I've listed all the outcome statements through here so you can see them. But infrastructure, organization culture, stewardship, and visitor and events tend to be the most talked about themes in this process. And so I'll be sharing, I wanted to preview this with you so you get to start thinking about this before we get to September as far as what direction you want us to go. We want the board, you all as the board, to give us what you feel are the priorities for us to move forward with. We can go forward with all 8. It's going to take a while to do a strategic plan with all 8 themes. We'd really like to hone that in and be strategic about it. And the next piece of this is going to be bringing in groups to look at those outcomes and then doing that gap analysis. So we don't want, time-wise, it's going to be challenging to do that with 8 themes. If you want to go to the next slide, that'll give you the last 4, education and history, marketing, branding, housing and lodging, and community and business. And so really good conversations. We really tried to keep the groups, I'd say we didn't let folks sit just as their own representations. We tried to mix the groups up so we had a good representation in the conversations. And it was really valuable for us to get some insights as we move forward in this. And I will mention there are several folks that participated in our focus groups here today, and so I'm glad that they're still involved in this process with Fort Monroe. You can go to the next slide. And so as I mentioned on the timing, we'll be looking, we haven't even had a chance to review this or sit down and really review this with the directors. We'll be doing that here in July and looking at that online engagement opportunity for those that couldn't make the focus groups and finalizing the input. And then we'll be bringing this back to you for some guidance and priorities at your September meeting. So our hope is by the end of this year, by your February meeting, you'll have a strategic plan that you can move forward with and to adopt. That's our timing in this. So the winter, fall timeframe will be working to do the planning process from those outcomes.
Are there any questions or comments, concerns with the process? Everyone's feeling good about where we're headed in the adjusted schedule given the COVID impacts?
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John.
One quick question. What's your format for board member input?
So right now we have you at that break point. So you're going to be setting the goals or what outcomes you want us to move forward in. We can look at what that looks like in what I call the strategic group areas. If you want to come into that process in some way, we can discuss that. But at this point, we had you in that midpoint of setting the visionary piece of what are the outcomes you want us to focus on.
So is that I'm just getting really down the weeds here.
Yep.
Is that a group discussion at a board meeting? Is that one-on-one interviews? What is the small groups? What's the process for collecting those?
So depending on which outcomes you have identified will determine what kind of stakeholders need to be at the table to address. Because if you decide to go with, in September, let's focus on a theme area and let's bring a group together on that theme, then that's going to define that we need a broader group to have that discussion. If you're focused on one outcome, for instance, one of those was around pedestrian infrastructure being good for pedestrians and accessible. That's a very defined outcome, a very small outcome. So you may not need a broad visionary perspective at the table. You may need more practical folks that are dealing with traffic and such.
Mr. Joseph's looking though, when is the board going to provide that format and that feedback and in what format? As I understood it, you and Mr. Oder are suggesting at a board meeting
Yes.
is when the board of trustees would express their priorities.
Yes. So in September we would have a conversation. We would facilitate a conversation with you all about how you would like to go about that next phase. But we want to bring that.
May I suggest that conversations are great, but that you somehow send out a directed questionnaire or
Yes.
some manner in advance of the meeting so that people can have time to think about it rather than have to be ad hoc.
That's a great
Yeah,
suggestion.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Any other suggestions or feedback?